All right, so let's continue with our afternoon session. And kicking us off will be Pieter Gunst. Pieter is a fellow with our center, and he's also a co-founder of Legal.io. I met Pieter almost 6 years ago, so when he was an LLM student in our program in law science and technology here, and he had been a big law firm lawyer. I think DLA Piper was your firm, and he came here, and then he and Tony Lai during their LLM year actually said, you know, we should create a marketplace that makes it easier for people to find the right lawyer, and they started Legal.io. Over the years, so they've been working on this, and I think real trailblazers in that area. And he's also, been awarded by different outlets. Forbes named him one of the 30 under 30 in law and policy. And Pieter's been been actively involved in CodeX, teaching our students how to code and how to build databases and that sort of thing. And so he's one of his projects that he used for his class was our CodeX Techindex, which is a database that tracks early-stage legal tech companies. And so I'm very happy that Pieter's going to give us an update on the database and will tell us about some trends he's seeing based on the data from the database. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Pieter Gunst.
Thank you, Roland. All right. So as Roland said, I am going to share some interesting information about some data that we've been collecting around legal tech startup and company activity. But really, what this short talk is going to be about is about education. It's going to be about data, and it's going to be about the power of openness and transparency. And I thought, given that it's after lunch, something I found educational. It's based on some data. And in the spirit of openness, I want to share this interesting piece. It's a research from about a decade ago where 8 Israeli judges were tracked as they were doing parole decisions. And it turned out that right after lunch, the parole decisions came back vastly more positive than otherwise. And so what you're seeing, the peaks, are the times where the judges have eaten. And the reason I'm saying this is twofold. Under your share, you'll find this evaluation form. And so we will ask you to fill this in. This helps us a lot in making the next FutureLaw fantastic, but be critical. If you think this presentation is great, it might have been the lunch. Now, the other thing is that data, which is really what this is going to be about, data leads to better decision making. And this is, I think, one of the great challenges and opportunities of our time, and especially in the legal profession. Legal data is this unstructured, siloed mess, and unlocking it has so much potential. But to do this, we need to basically create a new generation of legal professionals. And this is a field that I've had all the luck of being immersed in for almost a decade now. And the genesis of the Techindex, which we'll be going into a little bit later, was this thing called CodeX Law. It was this hands-on introduction to computer science for law students. And what happened is I had the massive luck of being able to study at the Stanford Law Science and Technology program back in 2010. And I met Tony the first day of that course, August 24th. We said we should do something together. And now, 7 years later, we've built a company together, had the privilege of helping many, many people navigate the legal system. But there was this problem. We were a bunch of lawyers, and we were going to build a technology company, and we had no idea how to do that. And so after we graduated, and it became clear that this was getting serious, and our friends, our family, and some investors here in the Valley gave us that first $100,000, we figured that we needed to level up our game, and if we were going to build a team, we would have to be able to speak their language. So I sent this email to Stanford Law School, which was, hey, everybody, I'm going to learn how to program. Every Wednesday night from now on, you'll find me in this room. And if you're also interested in learning how to code, you should come by. Also, if you don't come by, you're not going to have a job in a decade. Massive successful email, had about 75 signups, which is a reasonable percentage of this small and fantastic law school. And from then on, for 3 years, every Wednesday night, we kind of gathered people who were interested in learning about technology, not the law of technology, but the technology of law. And it all started very simple, Did you know that you can open a text editor and you can write some HTML and you have a website? And this is not about lawyers learning how to code per se. It's the kind of basic things that everyone should know today. It's just kind of helpful if you play a coordinating role or if you're building projects. But it is something we did, and I think more than 100 Stanford Law students throughout those years wrote their first line of code. So they learned what HTML was. They learned about the notion of CSS, being able to color something, lay it out, design it, right? So the different layers of a web application. We used this framework called CodeX to give students an introduction to JavaScript, like this layer of interactivity that you can bring into web applications. And the way we did that was with this application built by a couple of Stanford students also, using this little dog and moving him around in the world. And it's kind of generally applicable to coding. It's what's being used in the computer science department to give the introduction to programming, something similar. But these are some of the things that we ran these students through, kind of just upping their knowledge of these basic concepts. And all this was very hands-on. Students had to open a terminal. They see what's possible, right? Some introduction to Ruby, which is another general programming language. And then towards the end of the year, we would move it into full-fledged web applications, kind of taking all these combined learnings and building a more full-fledged web application. And it wasn't the only thing. When we started getting all these lessons in, we were looking at a tangible project that we could create together as a group that would allow us to apply this knowledge, but also be a useful tool for the things that we were interested in. And so came this idea of the Stanford Legal Techindex, which you can find at this URL. It was this database of legal technology companies, basically built by students as part of this teaching project. And going beyond technology, we learned about project management. Before coding the software, we wrote out what it is supposed to do. Everyone who thinks about starting a legal technology startup, the planning process, it's really important. It's where you can save a lot of time. All these students created GitHub accounts. They were able to push code into this, and we built this together. And so now, a couple of years later, we have this website. It is hosted on Stanford's domain. The CSS has been tweaked to fit the Stanford website style guidelines. And we've built up a curated list of 828 companies that are changing the way legal is done. And what's in that database, right? So it's legal technology companies. It's tracking both startups and more mature legal companies. The oldest record is 1929. It's a very wide variety of use cases. We have these large categories and a free tagging system. And geographically, these companies can be anywhere in the world. It's an open database. You can go to the website. You can add a new company. You can suggest corrections to existing records. We track things like name, like a description of the company, when was this company created, what is it trying to do. We track their online footprint, website, Twitter, Crunchbase, which contains funding information, geographic information, etc. So we built up this database tracking in 9 main categories. Marketplaces, matching clients and attorneys, document automation, practice management, and a wide variety, very specific applications for litigation alone, or more generic, like a Clio. We have legal research applications, applications around legal education, ODR, disputes, e-discovery, analytics companies, compliance. And now, what's interesting is we also implemented this open tagging system that's a bit more freeform, that allows us to see a bit more in real time, entered by users like trends, right? So a couple of years ago, we saw the first blockchain entry coming in. You see the notion of a smart contract, and all these things that are much more refined within these different categories. And the interesting thing is all this data is structured. So what I wanted to share a bit today was some of the interesting insights that come out of that and some of the trends that we're seeing. And this is an effort that we hope to continue. And I stand here, but this really has been done with the contributions of now over 100 people that have contributed data, code, etc. You can fork the application. It's completely open source. If you want to make your own version, send me an email. We can exchange data. In these categories, it's kind of interesting. You see market trends, right? So the largest set in this database are document automation companies. And I'll show it on a timeline a bit later, but this is a category that really has grown a lot recently. There's a lot of online marketplaces trying to connect attorneys and consumers. Practice management was a bit of an earlier category that was mature and also a lot of funding flew into. And now one of the things that we're seeing is also analytics companies kind of growing. And so these together, kind of 80% of the database. They have e-discovery, legal education, relatively small, ODR, and also compliance companies. And if you look over time, and this is the same graph, but kind of when were these companies founded, you can see that in the last last decade, document automation, legal marketplaces, legal practice management have really exploded as categories, right? And this makes a lot of sense because as some of the technology has matured, you're now really able to unlock the power of something like more complex document automation, also at a consumer-friendly level, right? But there's companies such as, for example, LegalZoom, right, going pretty far back that pioneered all of this. And so it's interesting if you look over time, and so we try to keep this data set up to date, you kind of see these larger industry trends of how the different verticals are developing, and the acceleration of that development and the slowdown. Now, another thing we do is we try to geocode the data. And what you see there is that there's the vast majority of the companies that we track, and I'll admit to the database probably being a bit biased, right? It's in English, so there's data that we're missing. But the vast majority of the activity is in the United States. And now more recently, we've been seeing more entries in other markets. Now, this might also just be the economic reality, right? Because often the legal market overall is estimated to about $600 billion, right? But half of that is spent in the United States. So it would make sense for technological developments to be a bit ahead of the game there, or to just be more viable economically in terms of existing. And this is another thing that's interesting. We try to cull this database as companies come and go, right? And it's kind of sometimes depressing, being a legal tech founder myself, to see how many of these companies just kind of die along the way. But that, too, is the reality of startups. Fundraising data, so we, with the collaboration of Crunchbase, we got enterprise access to all their data, which allowed us to kind of learn a bit more about the fundraising activity that's taking place. And so for the companies covered in the Techindex, right, so that is the restricted list, we've seen over $2.5 billion in venture funding. And this is all stages, angel, seed, A, B. Over more than 450 deals. Now, what's interesting there is that you kind of see that document automation, practice management, marketplaces, right? Like these large categories have sucked up a lot of the funding. And all of this peaked in 2015, where we saw more than $600 million in financing activity in the broader legal tech space. The years after that were a bit lower, The jury is still out for 2018, but we have seen some meaningful activity. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that many of these deals aren't public, right? We know of at least 100 transactions where the amounts were never disclosed. So this is an underestimate over the market reality, which is kind of encouraging to see, right? There's a lot of investor attention that's going into this space. And now, trailing behind a bit is, of course, mergers and acquisitions. The logical exit for many legal tech startups for a couple of reasons is an acquisition by a more mature player. And so of the companies in the database, we've seen over 100 M&A transactions. And that peak was in 2016. So note, the financing peak is 2015, and it would make sense that, the M&A deal count runs a bit behind this too. Legal research is very big in terms of M&A, practice management, document automation. Those three categories accounted for about 80% of M&A activity. And that's interesting because these are applications that are often adopted within corporate entities, and that's where most of the money is present. It's where your sales cycle is maybe a bit less brutal than when you try to sell to a law firm, things like that. So, and again, the large majority of this activity happened in the US. This is less based on data, but more like some of the recent trends we're seeing in the database, right? So cloud applications, yes, it's 2018, but it's still a big deal for legal professionals to move to the cloud. What's been very encouraging is that if you kind of see like the design of these applications and the adoption, there seems to be a lot of learning recently from consumer technologies. Mobile, right, is becoming important. We've realized that it's not because we're attorneys or legal professionals that we have to have crappily designed applications. It's nice if it's nice to use. So we see increasing attention for that. As a subcategory of the document automation space, we've seen a lot of this notion of intelligent agents or chatbots, right? That too kind of hit its peak, and now we see a bit less of that. But this big promise of making like the completion of a document or the generation of that a bit more user-friendly. And the categories of e-discovery, analytics, and automation, what we've seen a lot is like this tagging now includes artificial intelligence, right? So things moved from more traditional index search, kind of what Google pioneered, to now being able to, instead of searching things, like being able to flag things and make more intelligent conclusions. Another trend, and this is really the past like 18 months, is like this notion of distributed ledger technology, so blockchain and smart contracts. Potentially, we'll have to add a 10th category, although it's obviously affecting many of these others. But this is one of these new things that, maybe this is at its peak and it'll go away, but there's another narrative where this is going to be entirely transformative for the legal profession. And it's just so interesting to dive into. If I were to teach lawyers how to code again, I would include a piece on Solidity, which is a programming language on Ethereum for smart contracts. And really, if you're interested in learning a bit more about the technology of law, I highly encourage looking into that. It's fascinating. And then generally, and this goes into this notion of distributed ledger technology, is kind of this movement towards decentralization, which I think is very interesting for the legal profession, because if you think about, right, like the ethical rules that apply to the profession, like everything in terms of the regulation is basically geared against centralization. It's geared towards the individual nature of an attorney. And it's interesting to think how that will translate in the software layer and how some of these recent evolutions will play into that. Now, these are just a couple of tidbits out of this database. I hope to provide an update about this in the coming years, and we might see some interesting trends. Just the last thing that I wanted to do is kind of acknowledge some of the people that have worked on this. You'll see their name here, and this is from coding the actual thing to giving data. And one of the things to mention is like we created this project as an open source software, but we also treated the database as open source. And so what happened is people would email, hey, can I get this data? And we're like, absolutely, here it is, right? And amazing things started happening. Like I was in Belgium, my home country, at this random conference, and suddenly a slide comes up with an analysis of this database, right? Because you send the data around and you give it as a resource. And that's very powerful. Like some of these slides, like I didn't really create them or do the thinking. Other people did for me just because they got data. Like you got an email from someone at Google, an email from someone at Palantir who was like, hey, we ran through this data and we updated it. Here you go. 100 more records, 150 corrections, right? And if you contrast this with the notion of it's our data, right? We own this in our silo, versus unlocking this and just giving it to the community and seeing the innovation that can happen on top of that. I think this is both the spirit of why we created this, but also the big potential of the shift that we're seeing in the legal profession today. And I think that is just incredibly exciting. Thank you.